as you saw from the materials that went out, the focus of this seminar, we're going to spend about an hour talking about how to develop high quality survey items. And I'll talk a little bit more about what we mean by high quality as the time goes on. Before we get started, though, just a little bit of background. Just kind of about the seminar series. So there are going to be, and we've actually added a few since the initial message went out. So there are I think two more that have been added. So I'll send out more information about those, and those are going to be in late March and in April is when those will take place. So the idea here is the different faculty, like we all have sort of different expertise in different areas of research and different research methods, and so the idea is to really draw on that. So we're going to be several of us are going to be leading these seminars that are mostly going to be like 45 to 60 minutes in length, focused on one specific research topic. The aim here is to sort of be maybe a refresher or potentially a primer for those of you who are thinking of conducting your own research. So that would be, but maybe you're doing something in the case of surveys, like educators use surveys all the time, right? So this is relevant potentially to your work, but also to, if you're going to be using these methods in your dissertation. And the reason why we're recording these is because we're working on building a library of them, so that especially as you're in the stage of you kind of developing and refining your research topic and your methodology and so forth, that there will be this sort of set of videos kind of ready to go that aren't really going to be necessarily a replacement for taking certain courses, but would be a good refresher or a jumping off point and a good resource as you're working to do that. One thing before I'll, so you at least know my name because you saw that was on the thing, and looking at the audience, I think I've met most of you, so good to see you again. But just to quick introduce myself. So my name is Jason Burns. I'm an assistant professor here in educational leadership, management, and policy. This is my second year, so like I said, I've had the chance to meet some of you and look forward to meeting the rest of you as time goes on. Also, just please let me know if the quality of the feed gets disrupted or something like that. I've been having some internet connection issues recently, and so if the video cuts out or the audio cuts out or something like that, please just feel free to speak up and let me know, and I can slow down or go back or whatever. So here is our agenda, sort of the overview of what I'm going to cover here during our time today. So I'm going to start off with just a quick review of the larger survey process, and I put in here parentheses here, quantitative. There are qualitative approaches to surveys. There are qualitative approaches to surveys. I tend to think of surveys as being more quantitative, and that's sort of my background. That's how I've used primarily quantitative surveys. I'm also of the opinion, and this is my opinion, that if you're really looking to take a qualitative approach, then interviews or something like that might be more productive, or you might get higher quality data as opposed to trying to do a survey, which is very standardized, and you don't have the chance to ask follow-ups and stuff like that. Also, and I'll address this later, is qualitative survey. It's okay to use some qualitative sort of survey items here and there, but understand that like the level of effort and resources that are required to analyze that are just much higher. So that's just something to keep in mind. But again, I'll revisit that later. But suffice to say, for now, I'm talking about quantitative surveys, or surveys that are intended to generate data that can be analyzed using quantitative methods. So we'll do a review of that. I'll talk about some of the terminology that's related to survey work. So just some terms that we kind of use, and then that I'll keep referring to, kind of throughout the rest of this. And then the bulk of our time here is really going to be on instrumentation. So that's the process of developing items. And the way that I'm going to talk about how to develop high quality or good items is to start by talking about the characteristics of good items. So high quality items, good survey items should look like X, Y, and Z. Should have these kind of characteristics. Another way of talking about the what makes for a good item is kind of giving examples of what are bad survey items. So sort of, examples and non-examples for those of you who are used to, pedagogical terms. And then I'll talk a little bit about how to evaluate items. So, and what I mean by that is, there's sort of this iterative process where you're working on developing these items, and iterative meaning, you're going to develop something and you're going to think about it. You maybe make some tweaks, then you're going to try to get some other feedback from other people, and you're going to make some more tweaks. And so, there's sort of a loop there. And at the end of it, you want to be able to sort of kick the tires, so to speak, on what you've developed. And so I'll talk a little bit about how to do that so that you can be much more sort of confident in the claims that you would make with your survey data. At the end, I'll talk about some general tips for survey work, and also be any sort of questions that people have. I've done some smaller scale surveys working with students. I've in a high school setting. I've not done this with elementary kids, so there are some special considerations there. Potentially, I've also done large surveys, like in the order of about 10,000 teachers and administrators, so I can kind of draw on my experience and mistakes in doing some of that, and kind of share those sort of pro tips and answer questions you've got. And at the end, this is more for future reference, but I have some additional resources that are on a slide that you might want to consult later on. So just kind of jumping into it. So this is kind of generally speaking, the survey process. And so I'm putting this out here so that to sort of underscore that survey work is really a bunch of different kind of methodologies all put together. And instrumentation is going to be the focus of today. And so kind of to talk through this whole process and how instrumentation fits into it. So you start off like anything, putting together your research questions. And really, when you're going to do survey work, you've sort of come to the conclusion of, to answer this research question, I need to go get data. The data that I need to answer this research question just doesn't exist. And maybe that's because there's measures that aren't available to you. It could be like, well, I'm really interested in this group of people who haven't been surveyed, and so there's no data on that group of folks. But the idea is that you've determined that I need to go do data collection. And that's an important decision because, if you've gone through your methods sequence, your methods courses, if you're working with secondary data, it's just sitting there ready to go, which is really nice. And so you sort of said like, yeah, that's not going to work. I really need this specific data. So once you've gotten to that point, the next thing to do is talk about your population of interest. So this is the group of folks that you want to make an inference about. And I say folks, it doesn't have to be folks, right? You could be interested in schools, you could be interested in districts, you could be interested in students, in teachers, in principals and assistant principals, and athletic directors, and technology directors, and curriculum specialists, and reading specialists. You have a lot of freedom in how you define your population of interest, but you want to do that as specifically as possible. And by specifically, what I mean is you might say, I'm interested in K through 2, in comprehensive K through 2 educators in Bergen County, New Jersey. And the idea of specifying, like, being specific about who and where, it just makes things easier, down the line. And this is one of those things where, the more work, there are a few instances where I'll mention this, but like putting more work in at the front end is going to save you an awful lot at the back end. And ultimately, it's about doing all of these things to make sure that you get good data and to make sure that your data can answer the research question that you've asked. Because what you don't want to wind up is in a situation where it takes a lot of work to collect data, right? And so you don't want to be in a position where you've put in a lot of effort to get data and then come to the conclusion it's just not usable. So we want to avoid that. So once you've identified your population of interest with a high degree of specificity, the next thing is instrumentation. So that's what we're going to focus on today. And so instrumentation is the process of figuring out how you're going to get the data that you need to answer your research questions from that population of interest that you've identified. Usually this takes the form of, you're going to draft some sort of set of items that are going to be, we use electronic surveys most of the time these days, but then you might not be. And so the idea is you need to come up with sort of the set of questions, or we call them items, which I'll explain in a second, that you're going to put out there for people to respond to, and then that's going to generate the data that you want. After you've gone through this process of instrumentation, the next things are sampling. So you've identified a population of interest. Sampling is just the process of figuring out who from that population of interest are you going to get data from, because resources are limited. And so, like, if there's 1,000, I'll go back to the example that I just had of, if there's, you're interested in K through 2 comprehensive educators in Bergen County, New Jersey, there could be a couple thousand of them. Chances are you're not going to be able to get data from all of them, right? You're going to have to pick certain schools or certain districts, or something like that. So sampling is the process of making those decisions. And really, that just comes down to like being systematic, thinking things through ahead of time so that you're in a good position when you're ready to do your analysis. Then comes, data collection, which is the process of actually putting your survey out into the wild, putting your instrument out into the wild, and letting it go generate the data for you. Then once that's done, data cleaning and preparation. So this is just something that is by and large unavoidable, meaning that you have to do some things to your data before you can go, run the statistical tests or, whatever it is that you need to do. And then lastly, you've got your data. You're going to analyze your data and answer your research questions. So that's just a quick highlight of the whole survey process. And so we're focusing on just one part of it. So like I said, survey work is really a couple different methodologies all in one. And so this is just so that you know how this all fits in. So if you're thinking of conducting a survey, whether that's in your school, your organization, or you're doing something for your dissertation, these are kind of the other things that you'll need to think about, which some of the resources that I'll talk about later can kind of point you towards. We also offer a course in survey research that usually runs in the fall, and capacity depending might do more of these seminars and some of these other topics, like say sampling and things like that. So here are the terms. These are the kind of the main terms that I'll refer to. And again, you don't have to like jot all these down or anything, because I will make this the PowerPoint available. This is just for just to kind of put this in the back of your mind now, and for potentially for future reference. Like you've got this kind of list of things that's sort of a glossary for survey jargon. So a respondent, when I say respondent, that's whoever it is that's going to provide your information. And at the end of all of this, each respondent is going to be on one line of your data set. So your respondents could be teachers, they could, students, schools, however you want to think about it. So that's just, what is the entity that's giving you this data? A construct is one of the more kind of abstract terms. So a construct is I'm calling it a characteristic of interest. So these are like things that you want to get data on. So for instance, culture and climate within schools, that's a thing that we know is important, but it's a construct, it's an idea. Same thing with like say happiness, that's a construct. Professional commitment, that's a construct. Leadership effectiveness, that could be another construct. So these are all of the, there's not like a comprehensive sort of set of them. But so the constructs, these are the characteristics that we want to get data on. And items, so these are we might think of them as questions. Usually that's how we talk about them sort of conversationally. But an item here it's a prompt that you're going to use to measure a construct. And the reason why I say item instead of question is because if you've taken surveys, you've probably run into a situation where it'll say, please please state the extent to which you agree or disagree with the following 10 statements. And so that's one question really, but there are 10 items within that question. And so item is just a little bit more precise. So if you're thinking of a paper survey, an item is every time someone is going to make a mark on that. If you're thinking of an electronic survey, an item is every time you're asking someone to click on something. And an instrument is going to be the set of items that you present to respondents. And these are all going to come up at different times during the rest of the seminar here today. So response burden is this really important concept when you're talking about instrumentation or really doing survey work in general, and that is one way to think about it is it's the amount of effort or the energy that someone is going to sort of expend, that a respondent is going to expend to give you a response to help generate your data. And where this really comes into play, and I'll talk about this again later, is that this effort or energy is finite. Think of it as you've got about, I mean, this is getting ahead of myself, but I'll say it now and I'll say it again later. In most cases, you can expect to have about 10 minutes worth of effort or energy from your respondents. And basically after that, you're going to see people really drop off, meaning like they're just going to stop. And so you have to be really, sort of thoughtful in because each time you ask them to interact, each time you ask a respondent to interact with your survey, you're depleting a little bit of that energy. And so you just want to keep that in mind because you want to get the most information for the least amount of response effort or response burden or effort that you can. So validity and reliability, these come up in really all of your methods course. These are things that we think about just in quantitative research in general and in qualitative research, as well. And so here, just as a reminder, validity refers to the extent to which a measure or a construct or an item, really captures what it's supposed to. So if you ask a question about, say, teachers' professional commitment, this is something that's in the news a lot, right? Like the Great Resignation kind of stuff. And so when you're asking questions about that, you want to make sure that the item that you're asking actually captures something about teachers' intent to stay in the profession. So I don't know if you follow some of the educational reporting, but like back last fall, there was this huge, kind of concern about like, we're going to be losing a lot of teachers. Teachers are going to be going, all over the place. And not that that has not happened at all, but when you look at data back in the fall, it looked like there were tons of teachers who were ready to leave. Then not all that many of them, it turned out, did have left this academic year anyway. And so that gets at the idea of like, was that item, when you're asking, like, are you going to stay in your job? Did it actually predict whether people stayed in their job? So like that gets at the concept of validity. Reliability is also a characteristic of an item. And so really what that's about is consistency. So like so the same item should get the same kind of data from each person, each respondent, or it should get the same information across time. And so why this matters is because most of the time when we're collecting data, it's because we think that there's important variation, right? There's variability. Not everyone thinks the same. Not everyone feels the same. Not everyone sees this as being the same. And we want to capture that variation. But we want to make sure that the variation that we see reflects true variation and not random noise. So like, for the example that I use when I'm teaching this is, so in real life, my actual height is, I'm 6 feet 5 inches tall. But when I notice when I walk into various, gas stations and convenience stores, my height turns out to be somewhere between 6 feet and 7 feet. When you use those little, they've got those tapes usually on the door jambs, so that I think it's so they can estimate how tall a robber or something is. But that's an example of a really unreliable kind of set of measures. So I'm the same height, more or less, within a couple fraction of an inch throughout the course of a day. But my height is not varying a foot. And so if you were to take all of those measurements, it's very unreliable, inconsistent. And then bias is this other thing that we worry about. It's really kind of a special kind of, this is sort of the consequence of having something that's invalid or unreliable. And so this would be, when the measure that you get is consistently higher or lower than it should be. So for instance, if you ask people to, like people have done work on that, if you ask people to rate, like, how intelligent are they relative to the general population, thinks that they're above average, right? So this is an example of bias. Because if you ask people to evaluate their own intelligence, they're going to give you a score that's higher really than what it should be on average, right? Not everybody, if the average or the average would be at the 50th percentile, right? But if you take what people report, the average intelligence is at like the 63rd percentile or something like that. So clearly not right. So these are some of the terms these are the things that we think about, the words that we use talking about survey work. From sort of this overview of kind of survey research into the process of instrumentation. Again, this is assembling that set of items that you're going to administer to respondents. So this is, how do you generate this document, this set of items? So one thing to keep in mind, and I'm going to emphasize this a little bit here because I think it really helps to think through, what you're trying to do when you're conducting survey work. So measurement is, it's a process of taking characteristics of the real world and turning those into numbers that you can use for analysis. And in some cases, this is fairly straightforward, more or less. So some things are what we call directly observable. I mean, you can see them, right? Like you can kind of go and sort of, very easily count it or measure it or something like that. So height, for instance, right? You can observe that because you can take a yardstick or a ruler or a tape measure or whatever and go up to a bunch of people and, using whatever scale, whether it's inches or centimeters or whatever, and with years of schooling you can just count up, right? Like if they're in 3rd grade and they started in kindergarten, this is their 4th year of schooling. So these are things. This is what I mean by something being directly observable, and these things are comparatively pretty easy to count or to get data on. Other characteristics are latent, and what this means is that you can't directly observe them. And because you can't directly observe them, they're harder to measure. And oftentimes, these things you really care, or there's going to be latent variables. So like, for instance, satisfaction. You can't look at someone and see whether they're satisfied. Whether it's satisfied with a product, satisfied with a restaurant, anything like that. Socioeconomic status is something else that's really important, but it's latent. Culture and climate within schools or within departments, this professional commitment, educational aspiration, like what is, how far do you want to go in school or in graduate school or anything like that. These are all things that you can't just see about a person. And so what you have to do as the researchers, you have to come up with a way to get someone to give you that information. Since we can't do, we can't drill into people's heads or measure their thought waves in a way to read their mind, or anything like that. So what we have to do is we have to kind of think creatively about, okay, so what can I do that will get someone to give me information that will let me take a measurement about what their socioeconomic status? What kind of item could I craft? What kind of question could I ask someone to tell me something about their professional commitment? So this idea, the reason why I'm stressing this term measurement is like, try to keep that in mind when you're developing a set of survey items. I'm trying to take measures of things. It really stresses that you're trying to be, the aim is to be as scientific as possible. I find that to be helpful, just to kind of keep in the back of your mind. And so when you're doing this process, you're developing an instrument. So this means you're creating your measures. Here's kind of the process. And again, I'm going to start with an overview because this is we don't have a whole lot of time, unfortunately. So I'm going to start with an overview and then go into a little bit more detail on some of this. So what you want to start off doing in the process of developing an instrument is start off with the constructs that you need to and just research questions, because if you do that, it's going to help you make decisions down the road. So having a really strong research question should really suggest a lot about what kind of constructs you need to measure. Next thing that you need to do is, once you have identified the set of constructs that you want to measure, then what you have to do is develop indicators. And so indicators are, usually you can't get all the information you need about a construct from one item. Right, so think back to like professional commitment. Like, it's not just a, do you want to stay in your job? Like, it's not quite as simple as that. It can be like, what kind of value do you get out of, what kind of value or reward do you get out of, or intrinsically do you get out of your work? What do you think of your compensation? What do you think of your supervisor? These are all things you can get at professional commitment that are related to it. So these are all different indicators of that larger construct. The next thing to do, once you've come up with your set of constructs that you want to measure and indicators, things that would tell you about those constructs, this is something that I think a lot of people skip, but I encourage you to just do this. It can save you an awful lot. And so that is, review the existing research to identify survey items that have already been developed. This is really, when I say really important, part of it is it's good science, because if you're using the same measure as someone else used, then that makes it very easy to talk about why would your results be any different from this other survey if you're using some of the same items. It also means that if this is something that was published, then people put a lot of work into, when I said kicking the tires, to make sure that the items are good, you can lean on these other researchers that have done all of that for you and use their items. Of course, you want to give acknowledgement or something like that at some point. Taking whole items or whole instruments or items from instruments, that's totally fine. We do that a lot in survey work. then what you'll do after that, I mean, if you can find an instrument out there that is exactly what you need and you just need to give that instrument to a new population, that is great. Most of the time, though, you can't. And so then you're going to have to draft at least some items, right? So you might find certain items from the existing literature or existing instruments that are out there that work for you, but you might still say also need data on these other, so that you yourself. So this is where you draft things. There's this process for revising and drafting, and this is where I said, like, things, there's sort of the cyclical or iterative kind of component there. And then once you feel good about the items that you've got, the last thing is format your instrument for administration. And that formatting part is not something that we're going to, I mean, if there are questions about that at the end, I can talk about that. But it is important to think through, just because in the context of survey work, like, you're not there, right? So you're not asking these questions to someone, so you don't have the chance to, or they don't have the chance to ask you how to clarify something or figure out why something works or, or doesn't work. And so that's why you want to format it so that it's pretty self-guided. So going into more detail, this whole process, indicators. So start with this question of, what are the themes, what are the topics, what are the concepts that you need to measure to answer your research question. So usually when you're doing survey work, it's going to be like, what is principles, perceptions of XYZ and the relationship with ABC, right? So those things about principal perceptions of XYZ, those are your constructs. And the relationship with ABC, those might be your constructs, depending on whether you have data on that already or not. When you're doing that, this is one of those things where putting in the effort ahead of time really pays off in the long run, and that is, you really want to have a solid working definition of these things. So I'll go back to this topic of professional commitment is just on my mind. That's what I'm going to go. A pretty specific working definition of what that means. So is it professional commitment? Does that mean they want to stay in the profession? Does that mean that they want to stay in whatever their agency is? So if we're talking about teachers, does that mean that they want to stay in the exact same position? Does that mean that they just want to stay within their school? Does that mean that they want to stay within the teaching profession? Like, all of these are relevant to defining professional commitment in the case of teachers. Other things like effective leadership. If you walked up to 10 different people and asked them to define effective leadership, you're probably going to get at least 8 different definitions, I would think. And so when you're kind of going through this, you want to make sure that you clearly define what effective leadership is. And in doing this, I would encourage you to, instead of having to sort of make things up or do all the theorizing on your own, and by theorizing meaning lean on the literature. And by that, I mean, if you're really interested in this concept of effective leadership, I bet someone out there has come up with a definition of effective leadership that you can use to define, what that means for your study. Do that as much as possible. It's good. It's good work. Part of what makes for good science, right? Because you're using a definition that's already been developed out there, which means that you don't have to do the intellectual heavy lifting of defining that. It also means that when you've got data on it, you can, speak to this other research that uses that definition. Then once you've sort of got this set of constructs, what you then want to think about is, okay, so what pieces of information will tell me about about my constructs? So these little pieces of information that tell you about your construct are what we call indicators. These are they're often kind of narrow, right? And you want them to be. You want them to be clear. You want these things to be specific. Ideally, you want them tied to some theory, and by that I mean just like if you have this strong definition of what the construct is, all of your indicators need to be related to the definition of that construct. And most of the time, you'll wind up getting multiple indicators for a construct, and each of these indicators captures a different kind of element to it, a different component, a different facet of your construct. And this is an exercise, this graphic here, that I encourage students, whoever, if you're working on a survey, when you're in this sort of developmental stage, I encourage you to use this exercise because it can be really generative. So here's something we started with identifying this construct of job satisfaction. So like say, I really want to measure that because I'm interested in, and this is related to something I had done in the past. So like when more satisfied with their job, do they tend to stay in their school longer? I mean, it sounds like that there should be a relationship there, right? But we kind of don't always know what that, how that plays out, how strong that relationship is, or the extent, to which, for whom that's true, things like that. So to start off, you might say like, okay, so construct job satisfaction. What are kind of all of the things that are related to job satisfaction? What are the pieces of information that would tell you something about job satisfaction? So each of these little, kind of spokes that come off of job satisfaction points to an indicator. So relationships, and you can go further and further, right? And I encourage people when I've done this exercise in classes is kind of keep going out as far as you can until you're really specific. So relationships, coworkers, relationships with, say clients, relationships with, your supervisor. And maybe that's something that you're really especially focused on, right? I mean, I've heard you hear people say that people don't quit their job, they quit their boss. Like that's fundamentally about a relationship. Also benefits, right? So things like health insurance and retirement, or well, you can say like, yeah, that's all probably related to job satisfaction. So you might, from benefits, branch off a little bit more and say that you're interested in childcare benefits and tuition remission benefits and all of these other things. Social impact, you might say, okay, well, that's part of job satisfaction. Because it gets at, if you think that you're making a positive impact on the world, then that makes you more satisfied with the work that you're doing. And we can kind of, do that with all. And this is now for this construct of job satisfaction. And depending on the research question at hand, some of these might not be important at all. Right. So if you're interested in really of like what promotes job satisfaction or what increases job satisfaction, then this intent to remain question, like kind of indicator, is probably not your focus. So you might like not actually look at this particular indicator if that is your research question. In as much detail as you can, what's the construct, what are the indicators, get more and more specific. And the reason why you want to do this is because if you do the graphical version here, you'll eventually end up with a web that kind of shows you like all of kind of the indicators, all of the things that you might need to measure. Because once you get to where you've got a really, kind of specific set of things, those are that you need an item for that thing. So let's say that we look at relationships, and so and let's say we branch off of relationships, and this becomes relationships with coworkers, relationships with supervisors, and let's say we're still talking about teachers, and so we say, well, relationships with students, and then we say like, okay, so relationships with coworkers. Let's say we think like, what, I think that's pretty specific, and we'll stop there. So then what that means is you're going to need an item where you ask your respondents, you ask teachers about how would they rate the quality of their relationships with their coworkers. So this essentially becomes a shopping list, if that helps. So by thinking this through, by coming up with really solid definitions for your constructs, and then working with something like this to really identify the set of indicators that you need to measure about these constructs, then then you sort of a set of, this is the building block item on your survey. Then the literature review part. So you've got this sort of, I'll use the term shopping list, like, I need items that do these things. Think of it that way. First thing to do is go see what you can find that's already been done out there. If you have been reading a lot of research already, in the field or the area that you're studying, you've probably come across studies that use surveys already. Start there. You might even notice that things to use this certain, kind of set of items, or they all use these same sort of constructs, or something like that. And that can be really helpful, right? So borrow what you can. Like I mentioned before, when there's something that's been developed and published, meaning that it's in an academic journal, or you're seeing this from like the federal government puts out a lot of surveys, or the states will put out a lot of surveys, stuff like that. When those kinds of agents and entities put out surveys, they usually have to put out how have they served. And all of that is great, because you look at what did they do sort of analytically, and what conclusions did they come up with. Do you buy it? If you buy it, guess what? You've got a couple of items that are ready to go onto your instrument, which is great. Just always make sure to give attribution, meaning like, citation, whether that's in an appendix, or when you're talking about the method and you're writing up a method section, you might say, here's how I developed the survey. I borrowed items from these 5 instruments, or something like that. And then in an appendix, you might have a table that says, oh, here's my survey instrument, here's where I got the items, or something like that. For places to start, this is not an exhaustive list of places or repositories that you might go to look for surveys and survey items that have been developed, but the National Center for Education, Department of Education, they do an awful lot of survey work that really kind of spans the gamut. There's pre-K stuff, there's elementary stuff, there's high school stuff, secondary stuff, there's survey, higher education institutions. There's just an awful lot that's out there, and so you can draw from that. The National Institutes of Health, depending on what you're interested in, their instruments that they develop. I'm a little bit less familiar with their offerings, but they have stuff. Same with, say, the Census Bureau, tons of stuff that they do. There's a lot of good stuff that's out there, so it's worth checking it out. And even if you're not going to be taking specific items from an instrument, you might still say, like, I like this construct. Separately from how they've defined a construct, even if you say, yeah, I need different indicators. So now at the point where you're sort of faced with the task of developing original survey items. Keep in mind this idea that you're trying to take measures, right? Again, this is so that we want to be as scientific as possible. We want to get like really specific, very high quality data. That's really what we're after. Another broad consideration is that from your respondents, assume that you're probably going to get about 10 to 15 minutes. And this is assuming that you're working with, so I like say, like, kind of broadly speaking, educators in my experience nicer. And so the general public, like I've talked to people who work in marketing and those kinds of fields, and usually they estimate that they're going to get 45 seconds to 2 minutes with a survey respondent. So that could be relevant depending on what you're going to be collecting survey from. So if you're getting say parents, for instance, you're probably not going to get 10 to 15 minutes of time from parents. So you might be talking about something shorter. But as a starting point, assuming you're working with educators, figure on about 10 to 15 minutes, unless you're offering incentives. And incentives can be monetary. Incentives can be kind of loosely defined, and it sort of depends on who you are and what kind of connections you have. So, like, for instance, there was one of the large surveys that I ran. We were doing this survey in sort of coordination with the State Department of Education, and so we kind of worked it out with them where teachers who completed the survey got professional development credits that counted towards their recertification. So that was something that didn't cost us a lot, really didn't cost us anything, but was a pretty strong incentive for people to participate. So we ended up getting about 22 to 25 minutes out of them. Lastly, or sorry, not lastly, but the next thing is just broadly speaking, think that in one item you should be able to get a response in 10 or 20 seconds. So this means like for the person to read it, and then time for them to record a response, whether that's checking something with a paper and pencil, or clicking a button if you're talking about something electronic. Sometimes it's shorter, like if you get, we call them matrix style items, like rate your level of agreement or disagreement with the following 10 things. Each of those 10 things is going to take probably less than 10 seconds because they're not rereading the please rate your level of agreement or disagreement with these things over and over and over again. So you might get each of those in like 8 to 12 seconds. And all of that is relevant to thinking about like how much can you fit into your instrument and trust that it will get you good data. Also, know your target population. So that becomes really important in things around like language choice, what kind of constructs that you really want to measure. And so by target population, like these are the folks who you're interested in. So these are the people who you want to actually get data from. These are the people that you want to learn about. And again, that could be a certain set of schools or districts or teachers or principals or athletic directors or coaches or anything like that. But know your target population, and that's helpful. One, in just terms of defining or framing your study, but also that's helpful because it's not understood. So this comes down to like jargon or acronyms. And so here's an example of if you're doing work in K-12, lots of people are going to know what PBIS is, like positive behavioral intervention systems, but not everyone might. They might know the name of, say, their positive behavioral intervention system within their school, because every school usually comes up with their own kind of name for it. And so you have to think of like, okay, so I probably can't just say PBIS as an acronym. I need to define, sort of what that is so that the respondent doesn't say, no, I don't. Oh, you mean like cow cash, or like if the mascot's a cow or something like that. The other thing when it comes to knowing your target population is really focus and think about what are the really important things that you need to know, but you don't know. Because thinking back to like you have a finite amount of effort you're going to get from people, and so you want to make sure that the information you get the data you get has the most information. And what I mean by that is that you want to make sure that you can learn an awful lot from the data that you get. And so if you're asking like, by the way, what's your favorite color, or which football team do you root for, or like any of these kinds of questions that sometimes people want to put on because it makes it seem like you're a little bit friendlier, understand the opportunity cost to those kinds of things. Like you're leaving information on the table. The other thing to keep in mind, and this is just broadly, is the respondents you're not always going to get 100% of their focus. And so that's why it's important to, and also about, keep things simple, keep things straightforward, because, chances are people are going to be, if you're doing something electronic, I've seen, because the platforms that I've used and things like that. And so that's relevant because you just want to make sure that you're actually getting the right information. This goes back to the idea of measurement, right? You want to get like not just whatever random thought pops into their head when they see an item, but you want to make sure that you get the very specific piece of information that you're after from that person. Also, this is just kind of keep this in mind because research methods are often really challenging to implement. In the case of survey work, for instance, there are many ways that items can be constructed, lots of different words that can be used, lots of different ways that these words can be arranged and so forth. And so there isn't really a straightforward, like, to make a good survey item, do these 5 things, or all set. Just in terms of sort of setting your expectation. So, keep in mind that there's going to be a little bit of back and forth. You're going to kind of think, you're going to kind of ruminate. You're going to get feedback that hopefully is helpful and makes sense, but also sometimes you'll get feedback and you'll say like, I don't know if I agree with that, which happens. And if it's worth, keeping that in mind. There's not just one way to do this. You might be able to ask, if you're talking about, if it's a person who's giving you feedback, you have an opportunity to say, like, can you tell me more about that? Is that like is this from like your opinion, your experience, or like is there something empirical to that? And all of that's relevant. And again, to just kind of repeat again this idea that we really want to focus on measurement. We're trying to take measures. What you're trying to do when you draft an item is, so I like this phrase here, conjure up, right? Because it sort of implies kind of magic, right? So what you want to do is you want to come up with a set of words for your item that really spurs someone, your respondent, to think about this construct, and then gets them to record exactly what you want about that construct in a consistent way so that you can analyze it. So think about the items are supposed to get someone to think up or call up the information that you want to measure, and then you're going to make some decisions about how you want them to record that information on your survey so that you can analyze it. So moving on to the sort of the next step of like, okay, so aside from like these broad considerations, like what are the specific things that we need to think of or worry about? So starting here with a set of high quality items, or sorry, not high quality items, but like the characteristics rather of high quality items. And so what defines a high quality item should be valid. Sometimes we think of validity as accuracy, right? So we want these measures that we create to actually capture the information that they are intended to. So when you think of, let's see, what's a good example? So the example that I gave earlier about professional commitment, right? So in the fall, there's all this stuff about like teachers are going to be leaving. We're going to have an even worse shortage of teachers, and et cetera, et cetera. And in surveys, lots of teachers were reporting that they didn't want to be teachers anymore. Like, I'm ready to move on, like that kind of stuff. And it looked like there was actually a large, very large and concerning share of teachers who were wanting to do that. But folks who have looked at that within the basically since the first of the year, sort of like as schools and districts have recorded teacher mobility from the fall, what they found is that, well, not in 2021 with what they've been in the past in most places. And that's not universally true, but like kind of across the board, that's what it looks like. And so you might say, like, maybe those questions were not a valid measure whether teachers were going to actually leave or not. Reliability. So we want good measures are reliable. So what this means is they get consistent measures across people. Meaning that if you ask the same question to a bunch of different people, that should get them all to think of the same piece of information in their heads. They should all record it, in the same way. And so that means that the measures that you get, the measurements, the actual numbers that you get, are consistent. So they should be consistent across people. They should be consistent across time. Meaning that if you ask me, I'll stick with this professional commitment. If you ask me that in the morning, if you ask me that in the afternoon, if you ask me that tomorrow, you should get a pretty similar answer. Or like my example before about those, in gas stations and convenience stores, the height thing, right? So, very unreliable measures because you get different numbers even though my height hasn't changed. In some cases, the underlying construct might change, right? There might be reasons why you would think that certain subgroups within a population see this differently. Or, across time, you would expect some things to change a little bit, right? So you would expect people to respond a little bit differently to a question on job satisfaction on Friday afternoon as opposed to Monday morning, right? Like it wouldn't be unreasonable to see some slight differences there. The last thing here, a characteristic of a high quality item, is that it should be free of bias. So what that means is that the numbers that you get, the measures that you get from an item, aren't too high or too low. I'll come up with so I'll kind of come back to this, but there are lots of ways in which people are going to give you the wrong answer. And they're not trying to deceive you, but the measures, the numbers that you get aren't really representative of the truth. So the example I gave earlier was, if you ask people about their own intellectual ability or aptitude, then on average, people will say, oh, I'm this smart. But on average, people can only be of average, intelligence. And so that's an example of bias. People are going to overestimate their own intelligence and ability. People do this with all kinds of stuff, right? People overestimate how wealthy they are, how intelligent they are, how attractive they are, all of these things, because for understandable reasons, right? It's kind of self-serving. And so these are the characteristics of high quality items. Low quality items just have lower degrees of these things. So that's one way to think about it. So here are some things when you're drafting high quality items. This is what you want to do. And so, kind of think of this as maybe sort of a checklist, like think through these things, kind of for each item, or at least for each construct. So you want to ask about contemporary or recent phenomenon. And the idea here is that, people don't always have the best memory. So, for instance, in talking with some of the doctoral students in K-12 programs, sometimes people are interested in sort of what's happened because of the pandemic. Like, what sort of changes can we attribute to the onset of the pandemic? And so this is me, asking someone to remember what life was like in February of 2020 versus March of 2020, for instance. We're talking 2 years ago. Your memory's probably not going to be great, and so you might have reason to think of that maybe a measure asking about that could have some problems that might be unreliable because of inconsistency in people's memories. Lastly, ask one specific thing at a time. Like I said, oftentimes with constructs, there are multiple indicators that you're interested in. Just ask about each one separately. And the reason for that is because asking about one specific piece of information means that that item should register the same for each person, each respondent. Versus if you're asking multiple things at one time, you really kind of don't know what they're responding to. Also, you want to use clear, plain language. I think I've read that the New York Times is written with like a 10th or 11th grade reading level or something like that. And so you want to be simpler than that. Again, thinking of you're not always going to have people's attention for very long. You're kind of asking them to work for you for free. And so you want to make participation as easy as possible. So you use plain words, use plain language. Don't make your instrument visually complicated. So if you need to include pictures, you can, but try to avoid that kind of stuff. Avoid footnotes, avoid parentheticals, just try to keep it clear, try to keep it simple. You want to make, and the reason for doing all of this is you want to make it easy to respond. You want to make sure that everyone who is potentially going to be taking your survey interprets things the same way. Again, going back to this idea of measurement, think of your items are like a scale, right? You want to make sure that it gets the same piece of information in the same way from each respondent. Lastly, don't make assumptions about your respondent, and I'll talk with some of the non-examples. I'll give some more specific information about what I mean there. But pretend that you know nothing about your population. So it feels maybe sort of inconsistent, right? In that I tell you want to know your target population really well so that you know to ask the right things. But when you go to actually draft the items to ask them, you kind of have to step back and pretend that you don't know anything. Minimize response burden. Again, you want to be efficient. You want to make sure that you get the most information for the least effort from your respondents. And then the last thing, and I'll talk about this a little bit more kind of at the end when I talk about scaling, is you want to make sure that your items capture the natural variation. What that means is that if you think that there's lots of variation in, say, culture and climate across schools, then you want to make sure that your measures of culture and climate show differences across schools. If you think that should be the case, that's the natural variation. And the reason why I bring that up is because if you don't have variation, then you can't do anything with that variable in analysis. So going from these are the characteristics of what makes for a good item. These are some of the common bad items. So I'll start with this definition of them, and then I'll give a brief example. So don't do these things. Problematic items, avoid these. So these are examples where the guidance on the prior slides were not taken. So double-barreled items. It asks for, these are items that ask for more than one thing. They ask about more than one indicator, but really only allow one response. Unclear items. So this is when things are jargoned or different words mean different things to different people or in different contexts or anything like that. And so when things are unclear to the respondent, what that means is you've got a reliability problem because different people are going to interpret your item in different ways. You don't want to use leading items. So you don't want to telegraph to your respondent what they should put down. Loaded items are those that infer or presume some information about the respondent ahead of time. You also need to worry about socially desirable responses, meaning there are some topics, this is not present in all survey work, but in certain topics or certain areas, this is a real problem, is ahead of time, you think people know how to respond to this, right? So if you're interested in studying, say, any of the debates over critical race theory kind of things, you're going to be worried a lot about socially desirable response bias because people are going to lie to you. They're going to say, I know what kind of the socially acceptable response to this is, so I'm going to give you that independent of my actual feelings. And then lastly, recall bias is that, distant, more distantly past phenomenon or experiences are just going to be fuzzier. And so if you're going to ask about something with a time component, meaning tell me about something from 6 months ago, you need to have a pretty strong belief that they're actually going to accurately recall whatever it was that they thought or felt from 6 months ago. So here are some examples of these things. So here's a double-barreled item. Do you believe that standardized assessments are valid and reliable measures of students' knowledge? So in this case, someone could think that they are both valid and reliable and just say yes. Someone might say, well, they're valid but not reliable. So they might still say yes because they agree with one of them. Or they might say they're reliable but not valid, so they still say yes. And so you've got people with 3 different opinions, but all responded in the same way because this is double-barreled. So when I said that what this means is you don't know what to attribute their response to, that's what I mean is, do they think that if they say yes to this, does that mean that they think that tests are valid and reliable, or just valid or just reliable? And so there are some things that you could do to clear this up. Right, so you could ask separately, do you believe that standardized assessments are valid measures of students' knowledge? Do you believe that standardized assessments are reliable measures of students' knowledge? Or you just say, do you believe that standardized assessments are both valid and reliable? So those are ways that you could clarify this so that you'll actually know what the measures you get say. Unclear. Do you believe that there's a positive culture and climate within your department? So you need to figure out what you mean by positive culture and climate. This also could be double-barreled if culture is different than climate. And so there's just a lot more. This is very unclear. You kind of don't know what's going on, what's really being asked in this item. Leading items. What kind of class do you plan to take next semester? A course in which you learn to analyze and interpret quantitative data, or a random content course? So you can see just by the way that this is constructed, it's kind of steering, really telegraphing to the respondent, like you're going to take a quantitative, methods course, right? And this is something it's easier to do than you might think. So, recognizing a number of folks in the audience here who kind of work in schools, surveys about, mask mandates and reopening decisions and stuff like that. There's a lot of, they tend to have a lot, or the ones I've seen anyway, they tend to have a lot of leading questions, right? At least this is the case for where my children go to school, where you can tell the questions are written in alignment to get the answers that the superintendent wants. So that's, leading. Some others, so the other 3, so there's loaded questions. So this is where you're making presumptions, or the item makes presumptions about the respondent. So what's your favorite thing about summer? What if someone doesn't like summer? What's your favorite thing about teaching? What if there's someone who is a teacher who doesn't actually enjoy teaching? So that's loaded. Socially desirable response. So do you believe that all students should have equitable access to a quality education? If you ask this to a bunch of people, like we know that people don't actually think this, like universally, based on their behavior. But if you ask a bunch of people this, almost everybody is going to say yes. And so what that means is that, this is an example of bias. The answers you've got are different. They're much more biased towards equitable access than the truth. And then the last thing, recall bias. Like, I gave this example just a few moments ago about, asking people, like, how did you change your instruction when the pandemic hit your school? Like, recalling all of that from 2 years ago is going to be a challenge, or recalling it accurately. People would be able to respond to this, but whether they'd be able to respond to it in a way that accurately reflects what they did, I would say is kind of suspect. So we're heading towards, being able to wrap things up here. And the next thing here, so what I focus on is drafting the item. So this is the text that someone is going to see, your respondents are going to see. And again, the idea is that this item text is supposed to, prime your respondent or get them to think about or recall the information that you want. Then response formats are all about how are you going to get your respondent to record that information. Excuse me one second. So there are two general response formats. One is, we call them open responses. Sometimes these are called like qualitative items or something like that. And so what open responses are is there's a field or a text box, and your respondent is just going to input something. They're going to input their own information into that text box or field. It could be numbers, it could be text, whatever. Closed responses, on the other hand, you're giving a pre-specified set of options, and you're asking your respondent to select from one of them. This is my advice. So if you're going to do quantitative work, then you want, pardon me, then you're going to want a lot of closed responses rather than open responses. So sort of the pros and cons, they're relevant considerations when you're deciding on whether you want, and this is really item by item, right? So you've got text that gets your respondent to think of the information that you want to measure. And then, so for each of those, then you need to make a decision of like, how are you going to record that response? So kind of strengths and weaknesses of open responses, they let people provide any response. In theory, that could make the responses a little bit more authentic, but can require a lot of resources to analyze, because you have to do this qualitatively then. In some cases, like if you're asking someone to put in, say, a zip code, or you're asking someone to put in like what's your salary or something like that, you want to be really clear about how you want them to enter that information. Right, so this is a situation where if you want to, say you want to ask about salary, you can put in a box and say, please report your annual salary. Okay, and so some people might put in like, oh, okay, 50,000, and just leave it at that. Some people might write out the word 50, F-I-F-T-Y, 1,000, and spell it out. And you want to avoid that because you have to go clean all that up to be able to then work with it in analysis. So you just want to be specific. Other things to think about are that open responses have a much higher response burden, right? It takes a lot more effort to type something than it does to like tap a screen or just check a box kind of a deal. And so for those reasons, this is my advice. Open responses should be used sparingly, if at all. Closed responses, on the other hand, what makes them great is that they're pretty efficient, meaning they can get a lot of information for relatively little effort, because they have lower response burden. For that reason, I generally advise people like do almost all closed responses. Closed responses can be easier to analyze because you can have this set up so that it basically produces a list of numbers, and then from there it's pretty easy. Closed responses are generally going to be more reliable because it's the same item, it's the same set of responses that are given to everybody, and so it's more likely, therefore, that all of your respondents are interpreting your items the same way. Because you can look at closed responses statistically, generally it's a little bit easier to then evaluate them for validity, to assess their validity and their reliability. Another thing, and this is just I guess maybe this is more of a pro tip than a consideration here, but if you're using closed responses and your scale is continuous, like agree, disagree, like would or would not recommend, those kinds of scales. If you use a scale that's got 5 points, you can treat it as continuous and then like put it into a regression, or you can calculate averages and stuff like that. If you have 4 or fewer scale points, then you have to work really hard to make an argument that you can use that, take an average of that measure. I will kind of briefly move through this because I actually touched on most of this as I was discussing the last slide here. So for closed responses, like just keep in mind that you want variation, right? So the reason why you're asking a particular question is because you think some people think one way and other people think another way or have different experiences, and you want to capture that. So you want to make sure that your items actually get that, because worst case scenario is, well, also maybe this isn't worst case scenario, but bad case scenario is someone, you develop a bunch of items and then you get your data and you look and there's no variation. If there's no variation, the statistical methods and hypothesis tests that we do require there to be variation. If there's no variation, you're not going to be able to reach any conclusions. Another thing is make sure that you pick a scale that is appropriate for the item. So things like agree, disagree are really common, not very important, or not important at all to very important, very good to very poor, that kind of stuff. And there are some resources out there that are like, here are 10 different scales that you might want to consider using on your surveys. And so those are really good resources. And so, these, instead of just saying on a scale of 1 to 5, what do you think? You want to make sure that like you say, from agree to disagree, you want to make sure that all of those points are labeled so that you're not asking someone to kind of make their own determination about what a 4 means. Because doing that introduces reliability concerns. So if you just say 1 is agree, 5 is disagree, and you don't label 2, 3, and 4, then you have a reliability or concern about reliability, because a lot of different people can have they might define 3 differently and then use that to respond, and then you've got noise in your data. Also, for your scales, you never want more than 10 options. I would say you probably don't really want more than 7. So if you're going to use survey responses in like a regression or something, you probably want 5, 6, or 7 options on your scale, or points on your scale. And then when you're making some of these determinations, again, like a larger scale might let you capture more variation, because someone, if it's a 1 to 5 scale, someone might be like, yeah, I don't know if I'm a 3 or a 4, because I'm not quite in the middle, but I'm not really quite that close to a 5. If you went to a 7, then they might say like, oh, I'm a 4, or I'm a 5. I'm not a 4. That way they can indicate that they're not in the middle. They're kind of more to the right there. Also, relevant there is even numbers or odd numbers. Like, depending on what you're measuring, sometimes you want to force people to pick a side. If you really don't think that there's much of a middle ground on certain things, then don't include a middle option, meaning use an even number of scale points. That forces someone to go to one side or the other. That's a way of getting more variation, which is good. Odd numbers that allow for a middle option, you've got that lets you have a lot more sort of fence sitters, we call them, like people who don't want to make a decision of which side they fall on. And so what will happen is, sometimes you want that. You want people to indicate that they're really indifferent, but other times you want variation. If you have a middle point, you're going to have things are going to be kind of bunched up in the middle of that scale. Last couple of things. Generally, don't include an other option, because when people pick that, you don't know what they mean. And options, you want them to be exhaustive, meaning you want to make sure that everybody, no matter what they think about this indicator that you're trying to measure, there's a way for that person to respond. That's what I mean by exhaustive. You don't want a situation where someone says, well, I know how to answer this question, but there's no way that I can select that answer with the options that you've given me. So you want to avoid that. Last couple of things here. So this is more the point of like the part during which you're going to look to make some revisions to your instrument before you go actually field it. So these are different ways that you can get feedback, that you can get some information on item quality. So I'm not going to go into a ton of detail here. So this is more of kind of a launching off point for future reference. So expert review is where you have someone who is an expert in survey methodology or someone who's an expert in the content area that you're doing research in, and you ask them to like take a look, give some early thoughts, some early feedback. Cognitive interviews. So in those situations, basically you find someone who's part of your target population. This is someone who is in the group that you want to learn about, and you have them take the instrument and kind of think aloud. So narrate their inner monologue as they're responding to everything, and you're kind of off to the side taking notes. And the idea being that you're trying to observe as best you can the kind of thinking that's prompted by the items to make sure that aligns with what you want that instrument to generate. If you have lots of resources, you can do a pilot, which is you go and you like collect data from a small sample of people, and then you can do some statistics with that. And kind of get a sense, like kick the tires before you go do a full fielding of your instrument. Once you have some data, two things that you can do to get some evidence on item quality. So there's this technique called Chromebacks Alpha. So this is a statistical measure of the reliability of a set of items. So if you have several indicators for a construct, then Chromebacks Alpha is going to tell you whether those indicators actually, do they move together? Meaning, if if they all measure the same construct, then if you get a high response on one, should be high responses on all of them. Another thing that you can do is factor analysis, and there's going to be another one of these seminars on factor analysis in a couple of weeks, in case you're interested. So this is a statistical procedure that you can use to examine relationships between responses to different items. So meaning what you can do is you can say, all right, so I've got this instrument, I'm trying to measure 5 constructs. You can do factor analysis where you type some things into the software, and then it will tell you statistically, like, okay, yeah, it looks like there are 5 latent things in this data set. And you can take a look at that and say, okay, this aligns with what I wanted it to. So now I can be really confident that I've got a good instrument. So if you're interested in that, Dr. Gonzalez will be doing a seminar weeks, like I said. So last couple things here. So again, this is iterative. It takes several rounds. It takes a little bit of time, and the effort that you put in the early stages will pay off in the long run. Also, start on the same theme. Start with a good research question. Like having a good research question is going to help make a lot of decisions much easier. What constructs do I need to measure? Go to the research question. What kind of analyses do I need to? What do I need to data to and certain statistical tests you might need to run. So just keep all of that in mind, because that work early on is going to pay off down the road. And then lastly, additional to our books on survey research, you may wish to consult if you're going to be doing some survey work of your own. And then the last thing is, so for the last 2 years anyway, I've taught the survey methods course. And for that, I put together a set of YouTube videos on how to use Qualtrics, which is an electronic or digital, internet-based survey platform that you all have access to through Seton Hall. And there's a lot of cool stuff that you can do with it. And so there's this set of videos, just instructional videos on how to get a survey set up and running using Qualtrics.